I want to thank Dr. Herman, and please God, we'll have him back again for our motion. If he agrees and you agree, right, then we'll all agree. And I want to thank him for his series on the Geonim, as we said at the beginning, not a well-known subject, really. I think many people sort of a missing era of Jewish history, and it's really, there's much more to say. 4 hours is great, but it just scratches the surface. So, okay, Dr. Herman, we'll let you, Achron Chaviv, the last class for this particular series, and then we'll move forward. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rabbi Kalman.
And okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to ask somebody who's got.
Sorry, you just need to unmute yourself, Dr. Herman.
Yeah. Okay. Is my screen share working here? Excellent. Okay, great. All right. So as Rabbi Kalman said, this is the last of our 4 classes on the Geonim. Hopefully they have been, they've served their purpose, which was twofold, to introduce everyone to the world of the Geonim, to sort of situate these figures and sort of give a little bit of a map, a mental map perhaps, about who they were, how they developed, why they, when they were, etc. And also just to get a little bit of a sense of their contributions. These were figures who in many ways shaped medieval Judaism. And if you want to really understand someone like the Rif, who we talked about last week a little bit, or the Rambam, you really need to understand the world that they encountered. And that world was very, very much shaped by the Geonim, especially the later Geonim, who we've focused on in this series. As I said last week, as we did previously, I prefer everyone could sort of keep, as many people keep their cameras on as possible, just to make this sort of as interactive as possible. And I'll sort of take questions as we go, and feel free, of course, to interrupt. And I will, again, as we've been doing, invite people to participate, to read certain texts in English. Okay, so this is the last of our class. We've spent the first class sort of entering the Geonic world, as we called it, sort of understanding what the Geonim did and why they mattered. And then I introduced you to 4, this is the 4th one, major late Geonic figures. And these are basically, certainly in the later period, the Geonim that we know the most about. That is Saadia Gaon, Shura Gaon, Haya Gaon, and this week Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon. These are the figures we know the most about, the most we can sort of give a biography for, and certainly give an intellectual biography for. These are the figures who gave us the most writings, and we can sort of construct as much as we can of their worlds over other figures. There are some pre-Saadia figures who we know more about. Naturalism, I think I mentioned, is one of the figures who's most familiar to scholars. But generally speaking, as I said, with Saadia as a real turning point in terms of the intellectual and cultural output of the academies, as well as, I would think, and we'll see more about this with Shmuel ben Hofni especially, and as we saw with Shura and Haigon, a greater outward-looking position. That is, with the last of the Geonic figures, the Geonim began to look beyond the 4 walls of the academy and produce writings that were inviting and engaging with Jewish communities that were growing up throughout the Mediterranean. Some of which we know, like places like North Africa and Kairouan, that asked Shura the questions that prompted the Igeret. Other places we have fewer figures for, but we can assume, and we know that based on sort of geographic toponyms, etc., that the Geonim communicate with these places. So let's begin with our with an introduction to Shmuel ben Hofni as a figure. And the truth is, there's a lot that we don't know about Shmuel ben Hofni, about his personal life, and about sort of how he lived on a day-to-day basis. Everything we sort of know can be constructed based on other accounts of the academies, as well as his own writings, which really give us a viewpoint into obviously his intellectual output, less so into his family and his daily life, etc., as is the case with most medieval figures, save the Rambam. So the first thing to know about Shmuel ben Hofni's family is that he came from a Geonic family. This is not at all surprising, right? I think I mentioned this already, that the vast majority of the Geonim, and here Saadia is the exception that proves the rule, the vast majority of the Geonim came from families of other Geonim, right? So the leading families in Baghdad produced most of the leaders of the institutions, the they probably had the most money. They certainly led the yeshivot in Baghdad, as we saw. This and here you see three figures in Shmuel's family who were all Geonim. They are Cohen Tzedek ben Joseph Gaon, a figure we don't know that much about. Nehemiah Gaon, who we'll talk about more in a second, and who was his son, and Nehemiah's nephew, grandson of Cohen Tzedek, Shmuel ben Hofni, right? Not at all surprising that one family, one patrilineal line produced a number of Geonim, right? And also not surprising that the position was not handed down father to son, but as you see here, based on the dates, that there was a gap usually between when a father and a son, or in this case, an uncle and a nephew, took over to serve as Gaon, right? This is because the Gaonic families, while they were prominent, usually didn't appoint their own sons to take the place of their take their father's place once the father had died. It's also interesting in the case of Shmuel ben Hofni that these figures, here we'll see them again in Brody's list of the Geonim, right? These figures actually occupied places in two different academies, right? Cohen Tzedek and Nehemiah Gaon were both leaders of Pumbedita, whereas Shmuel ben Hofni was the head of the academy in Sura. Now, why this is, we don't really know. It requires a little bit of speculation, but it probably has to do with at least two major factors, maybe more. The first is an ongoing fight, it seems, between the Shmuel ben Hofni's family, Cohen Tzedek's descendants, and Shrira Gaon's descendants. As you see just on his list, there were, Brody put disputed after the in the 943 figure in Pumbedita. Right, Pumbedita was rocked by dispute, seemingly lasting decades, with breakoff figures and people starting their own splinter academies. Not all the details are well constructed, and we're really often looking through Shrira's eyes on these events. So we don't really know, certainly with objective perspective, what happened, as well as the fact that Sura was, as I said before, moribund basically throughout the 10th century, right? The appointment of Sadia, you see this, Brody has this interregnum before 928 when Sadia was appointed in the right-hand column in Sura, right, which tells us that the academy was not doing great. So Sadia had a very brief successor who here Brody tells us that resigned in 943, after which the academy was closed. So we're talking 40 plus years before there's another leader of Sura. And then again, when Shmuel ben Hofni comes in, almost at the turn of the millennium, right, we're talking about an academy that was not in good shape for decades in the latter part of the 10th century, perhaps the entire 10th century. And maybe these two things can go together. That is, maybe the fights in Pumbedita forced Shmuel ben Hofni to rejuvenate an academy. And this would help explain how he became the leader of Sura, right? It's also possible that, and this is, I think, a little more speculative, but one wonders to the extent to which Shmuel ben Hofni was sort of in Sadia Gaon's image. And I'll try and show this in the latter half of today's class. That is, Shmuel ben Hofni was more open-minded, more engaged, more productive theologically, etc., than his competitors in Pumbedita. Sura, maybe certainly in Sadia's times, became this sort of had its image as a different kind of place, perhaps, than the ideology put forward or implicit in their thought of Shura and Hai Gaon. One other thing you need to know about their families before we move on to the next slide is that Shmuel ben Hofni's daughter married Hai Gaon, right? So we're talking. So even though they were sort of contemporaries, Samuel was Hai Gaon's father-in-law. This, we don't really know much about this, but when this event is reported in Gaonic letters, it's linked with this idea that peace, shalom, was made between the two academies. So it suggests to me and to others that there is something of a political arranged marriage that sought to sort of tamp down on the bitterness between Shrira Gaon and Hai Gaon and their sort of model or their family, and Shmuel ben Hofni's family in the latter part of the 10th, beginning in the 11th century. Although, as we'll see in a minute, Shmuel ben Hofni and Hai Gaon did not always see eye to eye on some pretty important issues. Okay, so what do we know about Shmuel ben Hofni? So I'll just walk you through some of the earlier medieval sources before we try and get something a little bit bigger. So if you look here, this is a source we've talked about a number of times. This is Ibn Daud's Sefer HaKabbalah, written in late 12th century Spain, a sort of sacred history of rabbinic Judaism up until the Almohad persecutions in Spain, right? And here, Ibn Daud gives a lot of information about the Geonim, right, which he sort of assembled from other sources and probably added to his own spin sometimes, right? And here we have just a very brief line about Shmuel ben Hofni. Speaking here, we're talking about Hai Gaon. He says, "V'yamav, in the days of Hai Gaon, Haya Rosh Yeshiva b'Mata Machasya, that is Surah, Chotno Abi Ishto, that his wife's father, his father-in-law, that is Hai Gaon's father-in-law, was Shmuel Shmuel Kohen ben Hofni." Right? That's what we know. Gamhu, he tells us, Shmuel ben Hofni chiber svarim harbeh. He wrote lots and lots of books. Right? We don't know much about these books. Ibn Daud doesn't think that he needs to give us much detail. Perhaps people had access to them, or maybe he didn't have access to them. But we know he had already had this reputation in the late 12th century of writing many books. And this is repeated in the Meiri Seder HaKabbalah, which has a lot of similarities with, not just in title, with Ibn Daud's Sefer HaKabbalah, right? He tells us, Shmuel ben Hofni, Gam hu chiber svarim harbeh, he wrote lots of books, right? Here he adds in a little comment that is not found in Ibn Daud. He tells us that the contents of these works are not all that reliable. Right, so we already have it. Now we have 200 data points that we'll try and fill in a second. One is that we can say that Shmuel ben Hofni was very productive, right? He wrote lots and lots and lots, and that's something that is very clear. And it seems that he did not have the greatest reputation. That is, on certain matters, and not clear what they are here, whether it's halakhic matters or theological matters or something else, for some reason, he did not have the greatest reputation among later medieval rabbinic authorities, right? And we'll talk about why that is throughout today's class. Okay. One of the reasons that Shmuel ben Hofni was not accepted, or maybe his ideas were not considered as authoritative, is that he did battle with his son-in-law, Hai Gaon, about theological matters, right? And Hai Gaon, as we talked about last week, was respected as sort of the last and the greatest of the Geonim, the most important halakhic authority in the Gaonic period, right? And the very fact that we have certain shuvot where, and we'll read this one in a second, I'll ask someone to read in a second, where Hai Gaon disagrees, rejects his father-in-law's views, right, would probably have contributed to that idea that Shmuel ben Hofni was not perhaps a theological or otherwise authority that we should rely on, we being, later rabbinic figures. Does someone want to read this tshuva from the collection of Tshuvot HaGeonim? Lick, I know we had some good readers last time. Anyone want to jump in English for us?
Okay,
Yes.
I'll read.
Great.
Right. Okay, so Marav Shmuel Gaon and those like him who read many Gentile books say that these visions are only shown to prophets and that miracles are only performed for prophets.
Okay, so
They
here we
deny.
have, one second. So here we have something very interesting here, right? The first thing that Hai Gaon tells us is that his father-in-law, he barely wrote the Sifrei Nochrim, right? He read lots of Goyish writings, let's say. We could translate that into English. He read lots of writings by Gentiles, that is, Muslims, right? So now already he's telling us that that his father-in-law, Shmuel ben Hofni, maybe would, because of this, it infected his views, I think is what he's telling us. And therefore, the visions that appeared, here we're talking about some of the visions in rabbinic literature, he says, well, no, those were only for prophets, not for other people. Do you want to continue?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
They deny all events about which it is said that a miracle was done for a righteous person, saying that this is not a reliable halakha tradition. We believe that God does perform miracles for the righteous, even great wonders. It is not beyond him to show them the intimate details of his palaces and the stations of the angels.
Okay, here we have a very interesting comment from a lot. There's a lot to unpack here. We'll tell that, and that tells us a lot, I think, about both Hai Gaon and Shmuel ben Hofni. Right. The first is that Shmuel ben Hofni here denies that events done for the righteous individuals, that is, people who are not prophets, people in rabbinic literature and the Midrash, he says those are unreliable traditions. Here, the Hebrew word is halakha. The word halakha obviously does not mean law in this context. In fact, in most Geonic writings, when it's used to not mean sort of legal rulings, it very often means a tradition, a reliable tradition, a received tradition, something that we can trust. Right. So here, Shmuel Hofni is telling us that those reports in rabbinic literature about these miracles for individuals are not reliable. Right. So there's something of a sort of naturalist, a rationalist, let's say, perspective that's implied here. Also, he's telling us that within rabbinic literature, and we saw this last week, we'll see much more of it with Shmuel ben Hofni, that there's such thing as sort of reliable and unreliable reports, right? So we saw last week the Agadah, some Geonim said, well, those are not reliable. Meaning those are not true traditions, those are not received traditions. And Shmuel ben Hofni is telling us that these sort of miracles for people who are not prophets are not reliable. Whereas High Gaon said, no, we believe that is the case. We do trust and we take these things perhaps a little more literally, and we understand the stories in rabbinic literature to be more to be accepted and straightforward, perhaps interpreted in a more literal way. And we'll see that as we go on. Okay, so one other piece of Shmuel ben Hofni's image, and this tells us more, not because we trust it, but because it sort of speaks to what later people had to do about Shmuel ben Hofni, right? This was a letter that we saw last week from Yitzchak of Akko, right, in the Sefer Mi'irat Einayim, and I talked about last week how this story, in Yitzchak of Akko, has reports of the Geonim sort of pulling back from or counseling against this study of philosophy, right? And I mentioned that a number of scholars think that this letter is a later medieval forgery because it just doesn't seem to jive very well with what we know about the Geonim. And here, this is another passage of the letter that we didn't talk about last week. We have a source telling us this letter tells us that our teacher Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon, because he was, these words are a little hard to translate, a pioneer and a primary cause, right? Kodem and Ikar, I'm not sure of these matters of philosophy, witnessed the damages that come from them and withdrew from their study. So according to Yitzchak of Akko, right? Shmuel ben Hofni studied philosophy and then withdrew and said, no, we shouldn't study philosophy, right? There's no evidence in Shmuel ben Hofni's writings that this actually happened, right? There's nothing to support this idea, but what it tells us, I think, is that later figures realized how engaged Shmuel ben Hofni was with non-Jewish philosophy, theology, and they saw for them that was dangerous, and they must have said, well, it must be that Shmuel ben Hofni withdrew from these things, right? We have similar reports, perhaps, we have definitely similar reports about the Rambam allegedly converting to Kabbalah on his deathbed. Such stories are very common and obviously shouldn't be taken as historical truth, but tell us more about the people who recounted these stories. And in this case, there's obviously no reason to believe that Shmuel ben Hofni withdrew from the study of Gentile theology, only that later figures found this quite problematic. Okay, what about the other aspect of Shmuel ben Hofni, not only his sort of engagement with theology, but also his other, his writing. So here we have a medieval book list from the Cairo Geniza, right? That's organized based on author. Here on the bottom, anyone sort of sees the big line crossing through the manuscript. In the middle, on the bottom third, it says, on the right below this, it says Rabbeinu Sadia. So we have a list of Sadia Gaon's writings that were in this either bookseller or personal collection that were included. But here, on the top, you see a list of Samuel ben Hofni's writings, right? So this list is organized based on author, and clearly the person who's doing it wasn't sort of writing a list for public consumption, just for personal knowledge, and was writing all sorts of directions and not the neatest or easiest to read handwriting. But this is a very long list of but only a partial list of Shmuel ben Hofni's massive corpus, right? Anyone who makes sense knows that even the most basic Arabic, you can see that each of these words, these book titles starts with the letters Aleph Lamed, right? The something, right? The book of this, the book of that. Right, so that is very clear in Shmuel ben Hofni's writings. This is only a partial list of his massive corpus. What do we know about his published? So what published works are there? So the first one that was, I think the first one published of his monographs was this book on Hilchot Brachot, which is almost certainly a translation from the original Judeo-Arabic. Right, you could find this on Hebrew books under Sha'arei Brachot of Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon. We also have his commentary on Genesis that is translated, it's printed in a facing Arabic or Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew edition. Other works include a very, very interesting introduction to the Talmud. We'll talk about this in the second half of today's class. We have this book on the laws of maturity. Right? How do we? It's a sort of complicated Talmudic process. When do people become mature physically, and how does that impact their obligation to Jewish law? Why? What a lot of the stuff that I am. The best book I would say on certainly biography and collection of material on Shmuel ben Hofni is by David Sclair, who wrote this book, Samuel ben Hofni and His Cultural World. David published a number of two books in Arabic that he translated that are published in the back of this volume, which we'll see it a little bit later. And also another work that's included that was published not so long ago is by my colleague Tzvi Stampfer. This is Shmuel ben Hofni's Sefer HaGerushin, that is his book on the laws of divorce. Right? This is just
Yehuda Tzvi Stampfer.
Stampfer is a scholar living in Israel. Who has if you want to look him up, you can look him up on academia.edu. He's got some great writings on Shmuel ben Hofni and other important figures. Okay. Other works that have been published, there's one other work, just that I put a picture of here, is Shmuel ben Hofni's writings on the laws of tzitzit. This was included in a volume called Klil Techelet, right? That brought a number of medieval works on the laws of tzitzit, right? And other works that were not, that some of which have been printed and some not, are these letters. These are just two of a few dozen letters that we know Shmuel ben Hofni wrote that are published in the Cairo Geniza. Here, these two letters were both sent 20 plus years apart to the Jewish community in Cairo 1, which we already encountered today and last time, right? That reflect Shmuel ben Hofni's sort of program and public face. So there, I would say that we can say a lot about Shmuel ben Hofni. Each of these works tells us something new about our figure. But just summarizing, here you see the name Shmuel ben Hofni from a nice Geniza manuscript. A few things. One is that Shmuel ben Hofni was staggeringly productive, right? Sclair in his work lists something like 54 or more, almost 60 books or essays, theological, halakhic, and other topics that Samuel ben Hofni wrote. This is independent of the number of shuvot that he wrote, not so many of which survive, letters and other writings. So we know that when the Rishonim said that Shmuel ben Hofni wrote many books, that is certainly a position that we can uphold and say it's correct, right? It is true that Shmuel ben Hofni, perhaps more than other Geonim, other than arguably Sadia, was open to what they call Gentile, what we might sort of more specifically refer to as Muslim wisdom, right? He read a lot in non-Jewish literature, as his son-in-law tells us, and this apparently influenced his ideas, theological and otherwise. And he had as we said, a controversial and rather lukewarm reception among later medieval Jews, right? This starting, first and foremost with his son-in-law, Geonim, who tells us that, his father-in-law was not maybe correct on a number of theological matters. Okay, so that's sort of an introduction. Hopefully we can sort of get a sense of our figure, right? He lived in the late 10th, early 11th centuries, was the head of the academy in Surah from a prominent family who did a lot of wrote a lot of influential and controversial works in Arabic and Hebrew in Baghdad. Okay, so let's before we get to the next, so the content, who the Geonim were, who Shmuel ben Hofni was. The second half is what he contributed. We can pause for a couple questions now. Let me pull up I'm just going to open the chat quickly.
There's something that I asked you which didn't print very well.
Please.
Halacha.
Yes.
Esav Shoneh et Yaakov. Is it possible that the word halacha was used, that's a Geonic saying, and it means, as you say, an unreliable tradition, but not as we the halacha that we're accustomed to.
Yes, the history of the phrase halacha soned Esav soned Yaakov is long and convoluted. It's a good question. It's a good example. And I don't know the origin of that phrase in particular. I can't remember off the top of my head all the sort of detailed origin of that phrase. But the word halacha there clearly means tradition. It doesn't mean like a law. It doesn't mean there's some sort of obligation as a law, but it means a tradition. It means a sort of received tradition here. There's a couple other quick questions. One, just quickly here on the chat, there's a question about how the Geonim cited passages from the Talmud. So obviously some of them had manuscripts. Other times it seems like the Geonim Academies really insisted on oral transmission of the Talmud. We have a number of letters from the Geonim saying that the students of the yeshivot had never heard of anything of a book, right? It might be an exaggeration, but it certainly tells us that they prized oral transmission, and scholars sort of debate exactly how literally to take those statements. And then there's a question here about Shmuel ben Eli, who was the head of the academy in Baghdad in the battle with Maimonides. It's a good question. We have Shmuel ben Eli is a different sort of beast. He wasn't. There's no continual Gaonic tradition. He was more of a reconstituted academy. And Shmuel ben Eli certainly did not have as much as he tried to announce that he did, he certainly didn't have the intellectual heft of the earlier Geonim, and certainly did not have the authority that other Gaonic thinkers had up into the 11th century. But those are very good questions, and feel free to pipe in with more either in person, audio speaking or on the chat. Okay, so let's talk about some of Shmuel ben Hofni's major claims. I want to go through three different topics very briefly, each of which obviously deserves a much greater attention than we can give it in this introductory classes. So the first, I just want to talk about Shmuel ben Eli's theology. We already saw that this was controversial, and a major portion of his writings was dedicated to this topic. Then I want to talk about his introduction to the Talmud. We saw already a little bit how important this work was, but I want to show you what's interesting about it. And it's a really fascinating book that hopefully will be published not so long from now. Some pieces of it are already published. And finally, I want to show you sort of some of the controversies surrounding Shmuel ben Hofni as they pertain to this very specific story of the revivification of one of the prophets at Ein Dor, which may be familiar to anyone who's learned Sefer Shmuel. Okay, so let's talk first about Shmuel ben Hofni's theological writing. So one of the important and interesting theological works that Shmuel ben Hofni wrote, published by Sklar in his edition that I already showed you, called Shmuel ben Hofni and His Cultural World, is this book called The 10 Questions, right? Written in Arabic. Anyone can see this manuscript. Here's the manuscript from the very first question of the 10 questions, right? It says B'shmi Chachmana at the very first type, and then the first line, and then on the second line we already get into the Arabic here. Al-Masala, the first question is the following. Okay, we'll talk about the contents of the question in a second, right? So what do we know about this work? It was written obviously in the late 10th, early 11th century. We really can't date many of Shmuel ben Hofni's works sort of within the corpus. It's very difficult. Might be something we could do a little bit later as scholarship progresses, but not yet. Sklar says this was written in the tortuous and convoluted style of Kalam theology, right? This was very much written in the way that people wrote theology, that is, Muslims wrote theology in the late 10th, early 11th centuries, right? Clearly showing Samuel's deep familiarity with this material. And we don't know much about who posed these questions. It seems that they were actually questions asked of Shmuel ben Hofni, although I guess it's possible that he sort of invented them based on what he thought people would be interested in and used this as a format. It was sent to an unknown rabbinate correspondent. Sklar has some suggestions as to who it might be, but we don't know for sure. And what's another interesting piece of this, and this sort of distinguishes Samuel from Sadia, is that while he is very critical of the Karaites, he is in this work and elsewhere fairly respectful of them, right? He doesn't, he learns from them, or he treats, says nice things, has nice things to say about them. He certainly doesn't have the same kind of rancor that you find in the writings of Saadia Gaon. So what were the 10 questions? We don't actually have all 10 of them. We have a few, but I just want to show you some of the questions and then talk perhaps about what they mean. So the first question is the one you see here in the manuscript, is the following. Does agreement on something as a religious practice constitute an authoritative source for it or not? Okay, so it's a little bit of a strange question, something that we don't really know what it means, but if you understand Samuel's context, it actually becomes very, very clear. This is, namely, that in Islamic law, there's a concept called ijma, which means that agreement either of the nation, but more likely all of sort of the legal experts, right? And even though that practice or that ruling doesn't have a source in, authoritative literature, nevertheless, if there's communal consensus or juristic consensus about a practice, then it nevertheless has to be upheld. So this question that was posed of Samuel, or something that he invented, was asked, is that the case in Jewish law, right? So it already tells us something a little bit about his audience and about his correspondent. Here we have another very interesting question. Does the law of Moses, that is, the Torah, may peace be upon him, obligate others besides Israelites, right? Here we have a question about the universality of the law. Very interesting question. Obviously one that has ongoing, discourse in Jewish history, right? But one that took on a very specific meaning also in this same interreligious context, right? We have Christianity and certainly Islam sort of claiming to universal authority, and then everyone ideally or should be a Christian and a Muslim, even though the Muslims sort of let minorities live. They thought it was obviously better to be a Muslim than a Jew or a Christian, right? And so the question became sort of, what is the Jewish perspective on the universality of the law? And Samuel's answer, which we don't have time to go into, is certainly not as straightforward as we would think. One of the things that's striking about Samuel's writings on this topic, of which there are several, is that he certainly doesn't take the same perspective that you see in like 19th, 20th, 21st century Jewish thinkers, right? He's got a much more, optimistic or obligatory perhaps perspective on the idea that non-Jews have certain obligations than we're sort of maybe used to hearing in contemporary Jewish literature. Here we have another very, very straightforward question number 4, a very, very common question that was posed of many theologians in this period, right? Concerning, this is not a question, but a statement, I guess, concerning the imposition of obligation and associated matters. That is, what happens when, how can God impose obligations? What are the rules that pertain to the imposition of obligation? Upon whom can God place commandments, right? Do you have to be a certain age, a certain level of knowledge, a free person, et cetera, all these sort of basic questions. Really, you can see here very fundamental questions that are not treated, certainly in earlier Jewish literature, in a systematic way, the way that Shmuel ben Hofni did, and he did it in ways that were very similar to his non-Jewish contemporaries. And finally, an issue that we already saw in Saadia Gaon, and certainly was very enduring question, but concerning plain sense and figurative language. So here too, we have, this is obviously a pressing issue, and we saw, I guess 2 weeks ago, Saadia was very concerned with this topic. And Shmuel ben Hofni continues, as he does very often, he continues in sort of Saadia's veins. He doesn't always agree with Saadia, but he is very much on the same page topically as Saadia was. And here we have in the 10 questions, one of the questions is sort of how do we figure out when we should take texts literally, the plain sense, and when they should be interpreted figuratively. So that sort of gives us a sense, I think, of the big questions that he asks in this book on 10 questions. This is just one of, a dozen, maybe a little bit less, theological writings that Shmuel ben Hofni produced. But this one's actually accessible both in the original Arabic, and Sclair published it in English. So anyone who wants to read it can look in his edition, and you can get a sort of sense for what did he call it? A tortuous and convoluted style that this book is written in. It's very interesting, but it is certainly slow going, let's say. Okay. So that gives us a sense a little bit of Samuel's theological perspectives. What about this book that I've talked about a number of times, the Introduction to the Talmud, also written in Arabic? And here you see chapter 54 in the manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza. Right, the chapter heading, again, this is in Arabic. You have the Alf Lamed, the word the, right at the beginning, and a relatively clear reading. This is not the clearest of manuscripts, but we certainly can make out some of the letters. Isn't that, compared to other manuscripts, not that complicated? Okay, so there's a lot to say about this work. This is, I think, a very, very interesting Geonic work that in some ways might be compared to similar modern introductions to the Talmud that we see in English, in Hebrew, that are addressing and done for similar reasons. That is, that in the modern times, when someone has to write an introduction to the Talmud, it's usually for people who didn't come up in sort of the yeshiva system, right? I think the same is probably true about Shmuel ben Hofni's own introduction to the Talmud. That is, it isn't written for people who are already bought in or already educated in the system. Maybe it is, and it does provide some sort of big questions for them, but it's also written with beginners and other people in mind, right? And part of this you can see already in his choice of language, right? He didn't write this in Hebrew or in Aramaic, he wrote it in Arabic. So obviously he's writing it's like writing an English introduction to the Talmud. You're writing an Arabic introduction to the Talmud, it's the same idea. Your audience is clearly not, their first language is not the language of the Talmud, right? And he's clearly speaking to these to a broader audience and reaching out to them. And for this reason, this is an incredibly diverse work. And we're not going to have time to go through all of the different pieces of it, but we'll see in a second, it has a dictionary, it has methodological reflections on tradition that we'll delve into in a second. He has sort of introduction to people, who, what, where, when, why, sort of the people of the Talmud, where they lived, who they studied with, sort of all the basic things you'd get in any introduction to the Talmud that you find in the medieval period, or in the modern period, excuse me, is a lot of it is prefigured in Samuel's introduction. For that reason, it can be compared to a lot of these works that we see, that we might be familiar with today, right? And that makes it a very, very interesting work because it tells us so much about Samuel's audience, right? These were people who were perhaps not educated in yeshiva. They were curious intellectually. They had fluency in Arabic. They were comfortable with, Arabic and Islamic ideas that appear in this text, but they wanted, nevertheless, to access the Talmud. And Samuel, realizing that people outside of the academies needed a guidebook, wrote this lengthy work that is made up of well over 150 chapters. Right, this would have been a massive collection. Not all of it, unfortunately, survived, and only a few dozen chapters, maybe less, have been published. But more should be coming out in the next few years. Okay, so let's delve into some of the content of this work. I picked one chapter that is conveniently translated in English, or parts of it, by Brody, and which ties together with some of the issues that we saw already with Sadigon and with Shrir and Haigon. That is this concern, this interest with the nature of rabbinic tradition, right? And one of the major concerns about rabbinic tradition that came up in the medieval period and thereafter was what Samuel says in a little bit technical term, in this is the 5th chapter, the discourse concerning the causes as a result of which disagreements arose between the tradents, that is the transmitters of tradition, in the Mishnah and Talmud. And we say that this has 10 causes, right? This is a very long chapter title. I don't think anyone would get away with a chapter title with so many words today. But this was how people wrote in the medieval period, right? We have this chapter on why the rabbis debate so much. That's his question, the Mishnah and Talmud. And he tells us there are 10, what he calls causes for disagreement. And anyone who remembers from the previous sessions about Sadia and Shur and Haigon will recognize this problem, right? We want to explain why there's disagreement. And they're sort of hesitant to tell you, well, it's just because they were arguing, there's debate. So he comes up with other, what we might call excuses or explanations for disagreement, right? So I want to go through a few of them. I didn't translate them all, but there's a bunch of them that are worth reading. Maybe we'll skip some depending on the time. Okay, so he tells us the first cause for disagreement is that the tradition was transmitted concerning two sets of circumstances. In one case is negatively, and another case positively. Right, so we have two traditions. One say X is allowed, the other say it's not allowed, right? You can cook today you can't cook today. That's the tradition. And there's no contradiction between them. Why? Because they apply to different circumstances. When you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, on the festivals, when you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat, right? That's an example, right? He's telling us this is not entirely clear that there's good examples to prove this in rabbinic literature, but that's a pretty standard Geonic explanation, right? There's not real debate, not true debate, but just debates about how to apply the cases. The third cause is that transmitter's tradition gives rise to disagreement with respect to its interpretations, not with regard to the precise formulation. Because of this, they say to each other, did you hear this specifically, or did you derive it from a generalization, as they say in the Talmud, right? The Talmud tells us, Michlala Itmar, is this derived by implication, right? Or did you hear this explicitly, right? And therefore, later interpreters of the traditions, he tells us, could disagree about the interpretation of earlier traditions, not because there was mistakes, but just because things were not formulated precisely, perhaps. And number four, the fourth cause is that one of the traditions heard a general tradition and the other heard a specific tradition. This, the confusion between general and specific is something we saw in Sadia, and something comes up all over Islamic literature, right? And because they said, Rabbi Yochanan said, one cannot learn from general rules. So he says, why is there debate? Well, because some people tried to derive from general rules, and then that ended up contradicting specific traditions. But he's telling, but Samuel Hofni is telling us it's not really a contradiction. Right? He brings this passage from Rabbi Yochanan, which doesn't quite support his argument, but certainly is helpful in the general distinction. These are some of his excuses. Let's go on a couple more. And the fifth cause is that some of the traditions remembered the tradition, some forgot. Right? We saw Sadia already say something very similar. Right? People forgot, and that's why it's not because they were really arguing, but their memories weren't so good. It was a broken telephone model of tradition. And finally, the last one we'll see today is that some of the traditions, that is the rabbis, the transmitters, grasped the tradition, preserved it, and some of them did not grasp it because of their preoccupation, believed something different concerning it than what the transmitter has said. That is, people misunderstood. Right. So we have now, half a dozen of the 10 causes that Samuel Hofni identified, all of which sort of say debate did not come about because of earnest intellectual disagreement. Debate did not come about because people, sat down in text and argued about its meaning. Debate came about because of mistakes or because of misinterpretations, right? People were forgetful, people sort of assumed the wrong thing, but ultimately the tradition is unified and has a clear authority, and it all sort of comes back to received tradition, not to the creativity and the sort of interpretation and generative kind of reasoning that we see, that we might assume in rabbinic literature. And in fact, this Samuel Hofni here is the last of, but the most detailed of the Geonim, who really gives us this perspective on Jewish tradition. That is, the Geonic position is basically that the material in rabbinic literature is passed down from the prophets, right, who obviously received it from God. And debates come about because of mistakes or misunderstandings or something like that, as opposed to the position that's typified by the Rambam, which is that Chazal, or the rabbis, why do we have debate? Because they were thinking through the law and arguing about it, right? They saw an ambiguous text and they disagreed about its interpretation. That's sort of the Maimonidean position. And the Geonic position is, no, the debates came about because of mistakes or whatnot, and because all the material is ultimately not from the rabbis generating law, but the rabbis receiving it from the prophets and who received it from God, right? That's sort of the two models we have in the medieval Islamic world. And Shmuel Hofni is giving voice to that very firmly here. Okay, what else do we know about this introduction to the Talmud? Here we have a page from Abramson's edition of chapter 154. And here, just to give an example, the latter part of this work, as I said, treats not the sort of big questions that we just saw, but he is an organization of a collection of all the traditions associated with figures X, Y, and Z, right? So he names, whatever it is, a dozen, maybe more, rabbinic figures who appear in the Mishnah and Talmud, and tells us, here's all the traditions that this person collected, right? And here we have chapter 154 is about Nachum Hamadi, right? Not a very popular figure in rabbinic literature, not someone we're comes up all the time, but it just shows you sort of the thoroughness that Shmuel and Hofni presented when putting this work. And what seems like, obviously this is somebody who had a complete mastery of the Talmudic corpus, such that he could do such a thing. That is, such that he could say, oh, like what are the, I don't know what number he comes here, but 10 or 5, what times the Nachum Hamadi comes up in all of Shas, and he just rattles them off like that. Right? He didn't have a computer, he didn't have everything, to look everything up. Right? He knew these things very well and could organize them in this or really any other matter. This is the last chapter of the book, as you see with this closing poem. Okay, one other interesting component of this work is the dictionary of this work. Right, I already mentioned this. That this work includes many different things. One of which is a Talmudic dictionary, much like our Jastrow or Frank or whatever dictionaries people are familiar with that we all know and love. Right, here's just a page from this dictionary. Not all of this has been published, but here you have the entries on the letter Resh and the letter Shin. Right, people hopefully now know that the ligature at the beginning is the Aleph Lamed. So the first box here. So Aleph Lamed, Resh Yud Shin. Right, Al Resh, the letter Resh. Right, and at the bottom, he lists a few examples. Show them in a second. There's the letter Shin. Right, on the bottom. Right. So this is just a page from a dictionary that was part of this work, and here you have some examples of words that Samuel defined. Right, Ramya or Rimya, perhaps is pronounced here. The middle one, I think, is Rami, Resh Aleph Mem Yud. The third box here is Resha, like people might know that term from the Talmud, or Rigla. Right, all these terms, these Aramaic terms that appear in the Talmud. Right, that Shmuel ben Hofni thought he needed to define. Why did he think he needed to define them? Obviously, because he didn't think his audience knew what they meant, right? So clearly, this tells us, these can be tedious, but it's very interesting because what he's doing is then trying to make the Talmud accessible to people who wouldn't have had access to it, right? That's one important thing this tells us. It also tells us that this audience needed a dictionary, not in Hebrew or anything else, but in Arabic, right? So when they were understanding the technical terminology of the Babylonian Talmud, which is in Aramaic, they are thinking in Arabic. That's the kind of audience that he is speaking to, right? So what this work as a whole, right? This dictionary is just one piece of, I think, of a much larger puzzle that is this introduction to the Talmud that Shmuel ben Hofni wrote. It really shows us how interested he was in reaching beyond the 4 walls of the academy. Was this for fundraising purposes? Probably. Was it also just because he felt that this is how you should communicate and share the knowledge of the Talmud? Absolutely. Right? So it really tells us that Shmuel ben Hofni is sort of sitting at this moment where he realizes that the Talmud needs to be spread beyond just the yeshivot, and writing an introduction to the Talmud is a major part of that effort. That is to share the Talmud beyond the walls of the academy. Right? And this work was fairly popular in the medieval period, and apparently served its purpose, right? Much like many of the introductions to the Talmud we have, right? This was not a time period where people wrote art scrolls or full translations of the Talmud, but rather they wrote, introductory works that made things accessible, right? And this Shmuel ben Hofni's introduction to the Talmud, I think the first such work to do this, and really was fairly successful, and judging by how popular it was. In fact, if anyone opens the introduction to any standard edition of the Bavli in Brachot, you will see that there's a Mavo HaTalmud L'Shmuel HaNagid. Is that right? I think that's what it's titled. This has for a long time was erroneously associated with Shmuel HaNagid that we know as the poet and halachist from Spain, right? In fact, that is incorrect. And not only is it not authored by Shmuel HaNagid, it's only translated by a different figure, by a different Shmuel HaNagid. It's a translation of a summary of this very work, right? So anyone who has ever opened that, few pages in the end of Brachot in a standard Vilna Shas actually has access to this work in translation in summary form. So, sort of indirectly, but Shmuel ben Hofni's introduction to the Talmud is still printed in one way or another in the standard Vilna Shas, right? So this is a work that is of enduring significance, and I hope that now that we've sort of seen a little bit of it, if anyone wants to go back to that introduction to the Talmud of Shmuel, that's actually by Shmuel ben Hofni, you can see some of these ideas in translation, and breaking down some of the major questions that appear in this work. Okay, So one other major theme, and that is the witch of Endor, right? People who know might be familiar with this story, right? So Hamelech is interested in sort of accessing the ghost of Shmuel Hanavi, right? And he does so by way of a Baalat Ov, right? This is a sort of, I guess, a witch, as it's generally translated, and it's a very confusing, abnormal story, let's say, in Tanakh, and certainly something that certainly wouldn't have fit very nicely in our sort of rationalist, naturalist perspective of figures like Shmuel ben Hofni and other Geonim. Although we will see that Shmuel ben Hofni, his position was quite controversial about this issue, and this is sort of an interesting window into some of the broader Geonic battles over this topic. But before we get there, I want to show you one other sort of naturalist question that comes up in the Geonim, and that is about the talking donkey the talking snake or the talking donkeys of Chumash, right? This is a passage from Abraham and Ezra, right? Which is very accessible, right? Anyone can read this on Sefaria. I think that's where I got the first draft of this translation and probably tinkered with it a little bit. And does someone want to read Abraham and Ezra's summary of the Geonic views on this matter for us?
Rabbi Sarja Gowan says, since we know that only humans are intelligent and capable of speaking, we must conclude that neither the serpent nor Balaam's ass spoke. He argues that in reality an angel spoke for them. However, Rabbi Samuel ben Hofni took issue with him. On the other hand, Rabbi Solomon ibn Gabirol, the great Spanish scholar and poet who wrote metered verse, arose and disagreed with Rabbi Samuel ben Hofni. It appears to me that we are to interpret the account of the serpent literally.
Right. So the question here is, was there really a talking snake? Right. This is a reasonable question to ask. Right. And apparently, Ibn Ezra tells us this was a hotly debated issue in the scholarship before him. And as Dr. Lancaster and others could tell us, this is not the only time when Ibn Ezra is sort of a conduit for much longer and hotly debated issues among earlier thinkers. Right here, he's quoting three figures, two of which we can sort of expect to have written about these matters. That is Saadia Gaon and Shmuel ben Hofni. I would say, I certainly am, I'm surprised that figures like Shlomo ibn Gabirol, who we essentially know as a poet, Ibn Ezra thought was someone who was fitting to weigh in on this debate between Saadia and Shmuel ben Hofni as to whether or not these animals really spoke. Right. So according to Saadia, this didn't really happen. Right. It wasn't a literal speech, whereas Shmuel ben Hofni said it was a literal speech, and Ibn Gabirol said it was not. Right. So we have a sort of back and forth here. The details of which need not concern us. But what is interesting for this larger discussion of Shmuel ben Hofni is that here he seems to be at least according to Ibn Ezra, took a more literalist perspective. But in other places, he's much more of a naturalist, and that is what the witch of Endor is the Baalat Ov is why it is significant, right? Because of the very extreme naturalist, rationalist perspective of Shmuel ben Hofni. So here you have a page from Samuel's treatise on the abrogation of the law, right? This was a major topic, that is abrogation of the Torah. Obviously, it's a major topic when you're living in an interreligious world like Baghdad, where there's Christians and Muslims, arguing left and right that God changed God's mind about the authority of revelation, right? This work is, I think, currently being edited and translated into Hebrew by Zvi Stamfer. As you can see, the manuscript is, for anyone, it's fairly clear. This is just one page of several that have survived in the Cairo Geniza. And in this work, Shmuel ben Hofni, as we'll see in a second, cited and dealt with this question of the witch of Endor. Now, the question becomes, why would the revivification of a dead prophet come up in a discussion of abrogation? Right? I think that's a reasonable question to ask, something that I certainly asked. And Sclair, in his work on Shmuel ben Hofni, suggested he turned to a passage from Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot, right, his book of beliefs and opinions, where people were sort of debating different arguments for and against the idea of abrogation, right? And so one of the arguments in favor of the idea that God could abrogate the law was that just as God could give life and death and then revive, so too God could give the Torah, change the law to something else, right? So there was a close connection in the 10th and 11th centuries between the idea of the revivification of the dead and the world of abrogation, right? So that's according to Sclater. I think it sounds good to me without having the whole text as yet edited. It seems like that's why this question, the witch of Endor, the Baalat Og, came up in Shmuel ben Hofni's otherwise unrelated, or at least to us, would seem to be unrelated question of abrogation of the Torah. Okay, so here we have, and I'm not going to, because this text is not yet fully edited, I didn't want to go through and transcribe it and translate it myself. So I just gave you, we'll see in the next couple of slides, examples of later Rishonim citing Shmuel ben Hofni's views. So here we have from the Radak's commentary on Shmuel Aleph, reporting our concern. Someone want to take this passage from the Radak?
Okay. We are aware of a debate among the Geonim regarding this matter. Some say that Samuel did not speak with Saul, and heaven forfend, Samuel did not come out of his grave. Not at all. The woman did everything with trickery. This is the interpretation of Ben Hofni HaGaon. He said that even though the upshot of sages' words in the Gemara is that this happened literally, that the woman resuscitated Samuel, we do not accept such matters when they go against reason.
Okay, so according to Radak, we're going to go earlier in a second. According to the Radak, in his commentary, so apologies for the typos here, the Shmuel ben Hofni thought that this did not actually happen, right? That it was all a trick on the part of this woman. She sort of did her fake magic and fooled everyone around her. And even though if you open Chazal, it seems like it really did happen. They say that it happened literally. He says, no, we can't accept that because that goes against reason, right? Every person with a brain realizes that no Baalat Og can revive the dead, so too we can't accept that this happened literally. And we're going to see this is controversial in a second, right? If you look actually in a earlier Spanish commentary, Yehuda ibn Balaam, a very, very interesting and important commentary, we can see things in a little bit more detail. Here you have from Levin's Otzer Geonim, which we talked about in our times. Actually, this is just a Hebrew translation of Ibn Balaam's original Arabic that was published already in the 19th century by Harkavi. In his commentary on Shmuel Aleph, do you want to continue with this next page? Sure.
Know that Rabbi Samuel ben Hofni HaGaon denied that Samuel was resuscitated. He brought many lengthy proofs for this. He took the verse, quote, and Samuel said, that's what he said, which appears many times, to be the words of the woman who tricked Shaul and did all of this herself. He mentioned all of this in his treatise on the abrogation of the law. He maintained this against the view of the early ones, who thought that all the words were said by Shmuel HaNavi. Mm-hmm. He said, quote, the words of the early ones contradict reason. We need not accept them. He cited evidence to reject the veracity of this matter in his view.
There you go. Okay, so Ibn Balaam is again telling us, showing us a little bit more what's going on here. So a few things are interesting that are worth citing. The first, or worth explicating maybe. The first is Ibn Balaam's comment that they were lengthy proofs for this. This is not at all surprising, knowing we know everything about Shmuel ben Hofni. Right, this attempt to say when Shmuel Aleph says the prophet Shmuel said, right, which would imply that he was alive and no longer dead, right? And Shmuel ben Hofni says, no, this was all just a trick, right? And finally, and then we have again here this willingness to contradict the early ones, that is Chazal, the rabbis, and this is because of reason. It doesn't seem reasonable. It goes against what we know about the way of the world for the Baalat Og to have done such a thing. And here, elsewhere in Ibn Balaam's commentary, he tells us very similar. He makes very similar comments and shedding light a little bit on this huge debate, right? So here in Ibn Balaam's commentary, it tells us the following: Rabbeinu Sadia agreed with the early ones, that is, Sadia Gaon accepted the views of Chazal, of the rabbis, and took these events literally, right? And their statements, but he rejected the claim that the women knew all this secret knowledge, right? So even so, you see Sadia sort of dancing between the same problems. We can't really accept that this woman was such a, was really a witch, was really successful at what she wanted to do. But we nevertheless have to take the words of the rabbis literally, right? And then we see here, this will sort of round us out, and I hope that this was totally unsurprising statement, from Shmuel ben Hofni's son-in-law, right? He tells us the following: Rabbeinu Gaon agreed with Rabbeinu Sadia's view, right? That is, he took the arguably, let's say, more small c conservative position that these things happened literally. We have to understand them in a straightforward, literal manner. He said, that is, Gaon said, it is clear. Once a straightforward statement is set forth, that means once you have something that is said literally, right? Could be taken in a straightforward way, right? Established in a specific manner, we must accept it in a literal sense. That is, that it happened in that specific way, even if we could reinterpret, right? So here we have Gaon siding with Sadia and weighing in on a lot of issues that we've seen already, right? How literally are you supposed to take verses? How do you balance, this question of literal interpretation against other competing ways of knowing, that is, reason in this case, right? And what do we do about times that the rabbis say things that don't align with reason? That is, should we accept them literally, or are we able to reinterpret them? And can they even be rejected out of hand if they go against reason? So all of these issues come up in this question about the Balat Ov at Indor. So therefore, what we have here is a great example of so many of Shmuel ben Hofni's major concerns, right? He is very concerned about taking things literally. He's very concerned about how to balance reason. Clearly, I think it's not at all surprising. Some of these questions, the extreme views perhaps that Shmuel ben Hofni advocated for, are associated with more extreme positions within the Islamic world that Shmuel ben Hofni was aware of and repeated sometimes, right? So there's a lot of things going on in this one story. And really see a largely forgotten figure who typifies a lot of very interesting things going on. He's trying to advocate for the academies. He speaks more broadly. He's looking beyond. I said this is called looking outward, right? Looking outward, both outside of the academies and outside of the Jewish tradition, right? Shmuel ben Hofni did both of these things, and he was not always accepted when he tried to do that. I think it tells us a lot about the Gaonic period, about Shmuel ben Hofni as someone who really merits further study. And hopefully I've given you some insight and some beginnings to help frame further study into Gaonic literature. So thank you very much. That's sort of my prepared spiel. We can turn to some questions from the chat, and then obviously if anyone wants to jump in on the video, we'll do that as well. So very quickly, I see the new messages. We have this question of, I guess, continuing on this problem of Shmuel ben Eli. Yeah, Shmuel ben Eli did a lot in the late 12th century to sort of announce his own standing in the Jewish world, right? And he sort of showed off and had all sorts of public rituals and really tried to become the major figure. And this is part of the reason he probably, and almost definitely, did battle with the Rambam. The Rambam was unimpressed with all of these attempts to sort of declare himself to be the major authority. And the Rambam therefore, fought against it. So Shmuel, but it isn't, we can't really think of this as sort of a continuation of the Gaonic period, rather as a new way to restart, allegedly restart Gaonic authority. There's one shuvah from the students of Rabbeinu Tam, actually, who sent Shmuel ben Hofni a question, not Shmuel ben Hofni, Shmuel ben Eli, that is in the 12th century. They sent him a question. They said, what version of the Talmud is correct? Right? They had a question about the text. And it seems like they were prompted to do so because Baghdad or Bavel was sort of the authority of the text of the Talmud, because that's where it was written. But I don't think that doesn't tell us at all that this is a reconstituted Gaonic authority in all of its alleged glory. There's one other question here. about the Greenbaum's translation of Shmuel and Hofni's book on the Torah. I quoted that in the earlier slides. I don't actually have a physical copy of the book, just a PDF. And yeah, this is an important work. Greenbaum's, did a lot to bring this to bear. We already mentioned the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra is famously tells us the Geonim went on and on in their commentaries on the Torah and discussing a lot of, let's say, extraneous issues. This certainly is the case when it comes to Shmuel and Hofni's commentary on Bereshit and on Dvarim and other places that it survived. I'm just going to put my email in the chat again. And with that, I guess we can open to questions from people who are still participating. But maybe they're not. All right, so I think that if I take the silence as that everything has been understood, and that we are all excited to learn more about the Geonim. I thank everyone for coming, for participating, and for Torah in Motion for hosting. And I wish everyone a good day. And please be in touch if there's anything, any burning questions about the Geonim. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.